Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research, and their experiences. So, put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to The Sociology Show. This podcast is sponsored by Collins, high-quality student books, teacher guides, and unbeatable value revision for GCSE and A-level sociology. Sociology Show listeners can get 25% off Collins sociology resources until the end of December 2021, including the new book, How to Be a Sociologist, an inspiring introduction to studying sociology at A-level and university. If you're interested in taking up the offer, simply head to collins.co.uk/sociology show and enter the code sociology show at the checkout. Terms and conditions apply. The Sociology Show podcast is also brought to you in association with Tutor to You Sociology, the exam performance specialists for A-level and GCSE sociology students and teachers. And so you can visit their website, which is tutortoyou.net/sociology. And there you can pick up revision guides, flashcards, revision videos, and everything else that you need for your A-level or GCSE sociology needs. And so my guest for this episode is Dr. Christopher R. Matthews. Chris teaches at Nottingham Trent University, and he's recently released a book called Doing Immersive Research, Volume 1, Using Social Science to Understand the Human World. And for Chris, his real importance is how you actually do research, to be immersed, as he says, to actually get involved. And so I really enjoyed this interview. And so without further ado, let's go over to the interview with Dr. Christopher R. Matthews. So Christopher, thank you very much for joining me on the Sociology Show podcast.
No worries, my pleasure. I'm glad we could figure it out.
Yeah, I know it's been a bit of an effort to get you on the show for us both to match up our times, but I'm really delighted to have you on.
No sweat, I'm looking forward to it.
Great. So I always ask people to start by telling us a little bit about who you are and what you do, if you don't mind.
Okay, well, I'm Christopher R. Matthews. As we just said, in the kind of pre-show, I have to use that full name because it allows my research to be highlighted and searchable. I guess I'm a sociologist by training. I don't really use that term anymore. I tend to think of myself now as a social scientist for a variety of reasons. My background was in sociology of sport, specifically boxing. And more recently, I guess I work more on epistemology, ontology, and thinking a bit more deeply about research methods. That seems to be where my focus has gone. I currently work at Nottingham Trent University teaching sports students to try and think more deeply about the world of sport, usually using kind of social science and sociology as the main tool for that. So I teach a lot about violence, gender issues, racism, drug use. In some respect, all the kind of like cool, also dangerous, damaging things in sport, basically.
Now, I always ask people of this recently in terms of why that area of interest. I'm guessing you're a sportsman yourself.
Yeah, well, once upon a time, I'm, 41, so certainly on the downside of any of that sort of stuff. But yes, I've always been involved in sport. I had a very strange journey to get to academia. I wasn't very academic at school, always struggled with reading and writing, but just absolutely loved sport. And eventually, once I recognized that doing sport as a career it's very difficult to get on in sport because everyone wants to do it and everyone wants to do it for very cheap, basically. So I went and retrained. I did sports science, but I found that actually while I was doing the sports science degree at Loughborough, the thing that interested me the most was the stuff that allowed more critical thinking. Sociology being the kind of, there was a big strength, still is a strength of sociology at Loughborough. In terms of the sports sociology. And it also gave me the chance to think more deeply about some of the philosophical ideas that I quite liked as well. So that was my intro to getting into that area. Also, I'm very much a doer. I don't really like to think, although I think and read for a career, I like to just get on and do stuff. So I've found with my research doing sport was what I found to be the most enjoyable, and also the way in which I was able to understand social theory in more detail. I really struggled during my PhD to actually grasp what I was doing. I certainly wasn't at the level I was supposed to be by the end of the first year. I remember my supervisor telling me in quite distinct terms. But when we scraped through my first year review and I started collecting data, started doing it, started being in a gym and thinking about sociology and social theory via getting punched in the face, basically, and punching people in the face and a variety of other things connected to boxing, things started to make sense for me. So that's where that sport, that doing bit always has helped me, I think. So yeah, some sort of a sportsman, or maybe a retired one.
And I really like that expression, because I think that's key to what you're all about, actually, that you say if you want to understand what it's like to be a boxer, then you need to get punched in the face. In other words, you need to experience things to understand it.
Yeah, and it's somewhat more complex than that. My supervisor always used to, when I used to say things like that to him, he'd say, so if that means you want to understand something about murder, does that mean you need to be a murderer? And Weber says something similar, I think, in relation to one does not have to be Caesar to understand something about Caesar. So there is an element of kind of a challenge to that. But yes, the baseline is, to me, if you really want to understand what it's like to punch people and get punched, then a good start point is to punch people and get punched. That is, it seems very self-evident, doesn't it? But when I talk about this in my book, which we might talk about, or in research settings, I talk about this in relation to intimate familiarity, that kind of process of really getting to know something, someone, behaviors, etc. And just getting to know things from that kind of doing, from the knowing how people tick because you're kind of with them and you spend so much time with them. Again, yeah, you're right. That's the kind of stuff that I always do. I have to be careful because I'm so convinced that this is the best way to understand the world. I have to pull that back a little bit because obviously not everyone can do the sort of research I can do. Not every project requires it or needs it. And some projects need a more detached and a much bigger, wider sample. But I'm convinced that my work and the things that I'm interested in require, or at least I enjoy, maybe it might be another way of thinking about it, the doing, the being there, the living it, etc.
So would it be fair to say that you're quite influenced by the symbolic interactionists? I know in your book you talk about the likes of Bloomer and Cooley. That sort of approach has always interested you much more than the theoretical, I guess?
No, not quite. So okay. There's a little bit of complexity there. So that would be theoretical for a start. So that would be the theoretical ideas. I think we couldn't separate them out. But more so just for context there, we're talking about doing my book, doing Immersive Research Volume 1. And in that, I speak a lot about Bloomer's work, yes, and also Howard Becker's work, both very famous symbolic interactionists. And the reason I use that work is that it's an absolutely fantastic start point, both theoretically and methodologically, to get stuff done, to go into the field and to start going, right, what am I doing here? And it resonates with me really, really well. Bloomer, because it was written in the 60s and it has a kind of a stripped back nature to it, which I think is so important for people starting out in research. And Becker, for the same reason, although he's still writing now, has a kind of real stripped back brass tacks. This is what we've got to go and do. So when I'm writing Volume 1, and this is one of the nice things about writing in multiple volumes as books, and there's going to be 3 eventually. When I'm writing in Volume 1, it's to start getting stuff done, or as I say in the book, getting shit done. And symbolic interaction, I find to be one of the most positive ways of getting students in the field, theoretically considering stuff in a manageable way and empirically exploring the world. So that's my start point there for a lot of students. Not you must go read symbolic interaction, but that the ontological and epistemological start points that work provides means students go, right, I'm going to get into this. And then once the process of research has begun and people are collecting data and reconsidering things, the refinement of academic ideas, the refinement of social theory, the reading of extra stuff can commence a little bit more in detail, but it's that start point.
Thank you. And we'll explore that a little bit more. You've already mentioned your book, Doing Immersive Research, Using Social Science to Understand the Human World. Just for clarification, how do you actually define what immersive research is? I know there's a whole chapter on it, but do you want to give us sort of a definition of what it actually means?
Yeah, there is a definition in there which people can look at. But I think, and obviously that there's a smallest definition, which is based off a whole chapter of work, as you highlight. But I think the best way to define these things is always just with a more kind of off the cuff sort of thing. And the reason why I like intimate familiarity, two very simple words: intimate, to intimately know someone. And we, when I talk to my students about this, I have to draw them away from like sexual relationships. Okay, I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about knowing someone intimately. That process we all have in our lives. Some of us are more lucky to have intimate relationships with others, but we all have someone in our lives that we can know in that regard. So it's just a perfect example to say to people, who are the people that you know intimately? Who are those people? And do you know how they think? Do you know something about how they feel? Can you watch them and think, that person's thinking this? And I think most of us can, right? Most of us are partners in our lives, our best friends, are people that we've worked with for years. We get to know them in that intimate way. And then the familiarity of it is, the word familiar, right, from family. So it's kind of an aspirational term, because as researchers, the aspiration, I think, is to know people in a way, or to work towards know people in a way like we know our family. Now, I say it's aspirational. It's largely impossible to do that. But that doesn't mean to say we can't aspire to be in that situation. And when I talk to people about this, like, as you know, people who have kids, or people who have kids in their lives that they see a lot, adults tend to know those kids so well that they know them better than the kids themselves, so that parents can know their child's mind better than the child can, which I think is a great example of the sort of stuff that I'm trying to get towards. Obviously, that comes with loads of problems. The notion that you can know someone's mind, problematic. The notion that you can speak for those people is problematic. And I explore some of these issues in the book where I talk about the problems with this sort of stuff. But I think that's the best way to think about it, is spending time with people, deep time, long time, talking, feeling, experiencing, so that you build up some sort of intimate familiarity with them. And I think that instead of getting into a lot of the science, that's a really good way of starting with it.
I was getting, as you were saying it, I was thinking, is there a distinction between what you call immersive research and ethnography? Do you think there is a distinction there?
Yes. Well, it depends, obviously. I think there is not. If I hadn't have thought there was, I would have just said ethnography. Yeah. But again, as I highlight in an opening to one of the chapters, the term ethnography has become used so much that I often don't really understand what people mean by it. Now, because it's a sciencey sounding term, people are able to say, I did ethnography, I did it for this long with this much of hours and with these people, and that's that. And they move on and they've told me they've done ethnography. And I still wonder, were you intimately familiar with these people? Did you immerse yourself in that space? Now, immersion means something, right? In a simple sense, if I'm going to go into water, to be immersed in it does not mean getting my ankles wet. It means I'm probably going to get my head dunked, and I might even stay in there for quite a while. So it means if I say immersion, you don't think to yourself, oh, Chris went into a gym 5 times and, just hung around for a bit and repeated that. Chris went in and properly went in, and people knew him and he knew them and he spent time with them. And that for me is the kind of the central feature. Therefore, I value that term more than ethnography, because for me, as I say, it's been used in a way which I think removes it from that actual element. So the more I was thinking about the terminology, the more I was struggling with ethnography, because I was reading ethnographic work and I was thinking, yeah, that's literally ethnography, but it's not immersive. The more I kept thinking that, the more I thought, well, as far as I'm concerned, my work is immersive first and ethnographic second. So I'm going to start using that term because I think it's more valuable. And same with my students as well, postgrad students at least, because you can't really do this work that well at undergrad, but it's the same sort of thing. It's trying to get them to value this genuine immersion and genuine ability to try and develop intimate familiarity that I'm bothered about. I'm not bothered about if their work is ethnographic or not. And in some respects, we don't call it ethnographic because we don't feel like it is ethnographic, but it is immersive. So the two are similar, should be connected. But by using the term immersive, I think it forces me and the people that I work with to say what is immersive about it. And we've actually had that under review when we've had papers reviewed. People are like, what does this mean? And then we say what it means and we highlight what it means. It's like, okay, cool. That makes a bit of sense, I think.
Maybe it'd be good to hear to back that up, sort of some of your examples, if you like, Christopher. I know we've already talked about being in a boxing ring to fully immerse yourself in, but what other examples have you done to immerse yourself into the research deeply?
Well, the spaces that I have immersed myself is boxing. I mean, lots of different places. I have done other research in different topics, but it's never been my central feature. Mm. So in terms of the examples, I will have to draw back on boxing again. I mean, the obvious one, and it's the shift because immersion can happen in different ways at different times and all the rest of it. When I first started boxing, I very quickly went into sparring and did that for years. But eventually, when I finished my PhD and kind of put an end to that project, I restarted boxing when I was older. So we're now talking in my 30s, yes, mid 30s even. So way too old to be boxing for a start, as far as I'm concerned. But then I started competing. And at that point, the immersion shifted again because I went from someone who was really immersed in a boxing setting for hours and hours and knew people really well. So, genuine immersion. But to the second kind of stint of doing this sort of work, real big stint, I shifted to competing as the main focus. So actually my immersion with certain people became less. So I was competing, and the shifting of the work focused more egotistically into me and my abilities to get better and survive in a boxing ring. At that point, the research shifted to a point where it was very much more focused on my experiences. From that, I had a bunch of health issues that is probably people can imagine you get when you get punched in the head. That process is not a fundamental part of my research in terms of its ethics, right? I can't go to the university and say, I want to go and get punched in the head so I can understand getting punched in the head. They wouldn't let that for their ethical reasons, quite obvious ethical reasons. But the byproduct of it was by being immersed in that space, by being so involved in wanting to compete, and competing also was the most enjoyable thing I've ever done in my life, was competing and training for competition in boxing. I miss it to this day. That process enabled me to open up a whole new world of research after I'd basically got concussions in the ring. And being able to explore that with people and discuss my own personal problems with it brought forth a completely different data set, which I didn't have access to before. So going that other stage of sorry, I was going to say deeper, but it's not necessarily deeper. It's a different sort of immersion that enabled me to get into a whole new world of stuff with people, and produced at that time, I think it was last year, beginning of last year, this was published, a paper on concussion, which I think at the time was my best piece of work. Was my favorite piece of work. Shifted a little bit now because we've got some more work that's followed, which I think is really important. But regardless, the shifting of immersion and of having those things happen to me, wanting to carry on despite knowing that I was not able to lay down memories and that I was getting headaches all the time, and I was still desperate to keep competing. That was an incredible experience to be able to hear myself say those things. I want to compete despite what this is doing to my brain. That was a great thing for me to kind of experience, because it opened up a whole new world for me to explore with participants.
I'm just thinking of the practicality of that, because obviously when you're in the boxing ring, your focus must 100% be the boxing. So how did you record your feelings and your emotions? Did you do it straight after, the following day? I'm really interested how you did that.
Yeah, it's a great question as well, isn't it? Fundamentally, you are, one of the best bits about boxing is it's such a, you have to be present. There's no checking your Twitter when you're boxing. Yeah. There's no thinking about anything else. There's a guy who's trying to take your head off and you're trying to take his head off. It's slightly more nuanced than that, obviously, because it's, a lot of this is sparring and we're actually looking after each other, but still that immediacy of the experience is fantastic. So we could get into kind of quite deep ontological and epistemological issues around reflections even being possible upon that, because the reflections have to be retrospective. As you're highlighting, I have to step out of the ring. I can't be in a ring with trying to punch someone and go, "Ooh, how do I feel about this moment of trying to be punched?" Now, there are elements of that, and I reflect on. I remember having a thought at the time of what I think we could probably describe as at least a concussion symptom. I got a big grey shape that appeared in my peripheral vision, which moved. As I moved my head, it moved with me. And I remember saying to myself at that time, "Oh, that's concussion then." And I remember thinking, "Oh, remember that." And also thinking, "Shit, I need to carry on here because I'm going to get punched again." So I guess to answer the question, it has to be retrospective, fundamentally. And if you try and do it as quickly as possible, that's usually better, right? But these things are so dramatic and they're so personal and they're so visceral that the experiences stay with you quite well. Yes, it's always retrospective. Yes, it's always problematic because of memories, and especially when you're getting punched in the head, right? But yes, the answer is I always had, after I figured out that I couldn't really use a notebook because people thought I was a journalist, I'd be okay to get my phone out though. So just after sparring, I'd take my gloves off and I'd put some notes in. And the notes were usually more objective than descriptive.
Yeah.
This many rounds, this person, this time, this coach was watching, so that I could remember the specifics of the details. And then afterwards, the more poetic ways of understanding it, because that's what you need for this sort of stuff. You know, with subjective, like flowery language is needed. It really is, to be able to grasp what these experiences are like. They'd come, I think, afterwards, and their, you know, retrospective, often emotional reflections on this experience. You know, like the excitement of it, the tension of it, the fear of it, the joy of landing a punch on someone. Those sort of reflections, they always stayed with me quite well as far as I could see, and I wrote them down often in the evening or the next day.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for the Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
Did you ever go back and look at what you put and you can't remember doing it? Do you know what I mean? The excitement, the adrenaline of what you were typing at the time.
No. Because again, I'd look back at my phone and it would be, you know, somewhat objective. It'd be like, okay, there's the details of that, yeah. And I'd remember. And then the next day, I'd be able to write things. I mean, years later, yes, when I go back, all these things merge. But there's such a consistency to the story that I experienced of, like I've said, joy and happiness at doing it, and expressiveness and camaraderie and all this stuff, that as soon as I start reading them, I recognize it. And then when something actually is a little bit different, like, you know, a bad session or where someone was bullying in the ring or something, that stands out, and I usually remember them. Does that make sense? So the very normal stuff, it's like the same, it's almost a stream of conscious memory. It's like, yeah, another one of those sessions. Yeah, I remember feeling like that. And I may not remember the perfect example, but I remember the broad things.
Because you've already mentioned it briefly that there may be some issues with it, and actually one of your chapters is about some problems with immersive research. I mean, it sounds the best way to do research to me, but what are some of the potential issues with it?
Well, let's start off with the kind of obvious stuff of the time that's involved.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I've been doing this for over a decade. This is basically 15 years now. And I've been lucky enough, and it really is a luck that I've been able to do it this way. A PhD had very little pressure on how I collected data. Moving through my career, I've had very little pressure on how I collect data. You know, I've had very little success in funding. Therefore, I've not had to go and do a project that's led by responding to funders and responding to the need of stakeholders. I've done what I wanted to do. Now, the best way for me to go and collect data is to go and do something that I love, because I just spend hours and hours and hours in a boxing gym, and I'd be happy doing it. Fundamentally, that's work. It goes down as data that's collected for projects, but I absolutely loved it. So I had no issue there. So the time constraints are very limiting for many people. And that's where we lead to what I call snapshot methods, right? Okay, we've got to get this data on this project. We've not got long, so we best do it quick. What does that mean? One-off interviews, surveys, and the like. And they're sometimes essential. They are sometimes essential, and I accept that. But then let's say that we've kind of mitigated that, and we can do some research that takes a more longitudinal sort of fashion, more immersive sort of strategies. Then we get into some of the more challenging philosophical issues around closeness to people, and how do we one, manage that closeness, because as soon as we're close we can't see from far away, right? As soon as I get so detailed into the table that I'm working on now, I can see the fine grain of it, but at the same time I can't necessarily see the width of the table anymore because I'm looking at the fine grain. There's ways to manage that. You can move your situation within the gym or the subculture inwards and outwards, more involved, less involved, more detached. So you can move, and we often think of the researcher as like in a static position, which is nonsense. Our position within the research always fundamentally moves, and we get to know some people, we don't get to know some people. So why don't we make that movement a part of our process? Actually, what I'm going to do towards the end of this project is I'm just going to pull myself out. I'm going to be less involved. I'm going to speak to people less, and I'm just going to sit at the outside. So I've done that as well in boxing, where instead of sparring, I've gone in and just watched from the top or watched from the side, and I've coached people, and I've done things from that kind of more detached view. So that's one way of managing some of those issues, of getting this closeness to it. And then the other thing comes when we are really involved with these people and we think that we can share their stories. And I talk about this in the book as the notion of not becoming a boxer. And I think in most objective ways, it would be, fair to say I became a boxer. I had a boxing license. I had 3 fights. Yes, lost 2, won 1. Not the greatest record. But fundamentally, I can claim to be a boxer or former boxer. But also fundamentally, I'm not, in that I don't share a lot of the situations that my fellow boxers shared. Many of them were much younger than me. Amateur boxing is a young boys sport mainly. Yes, there's more and more women and girls involved in it, but it's a young boys sport basically. And most of those people involved in it don't have the opportunity to work as a full-time academic with all the privilege, the financial security that comes with that. So their experience of boxing can be very, very different to mine. For example, I can pull myself out of boxing, and did pull myself out of boxing at any point when I felt like I needed to. And that's it. No one's like, oh, you're not a boxer anymore, because I never was a boxer. I was always an academic who did research on boxing. So what that means is that we can find ourselves in a situation where we feel so involved with these people that I am a boxer, that I know them, and that I start to tell their story as if it's my story. And that's a real issue with this sort of work. The closer you get, the more, yes, you do understand, but at the same time, the more risky it can become, the more the chance of missing their story and mistaking it for your own, I think, can become increasingly, the chance can become increasingly high, and it becomes increasingly problematic when people don't reflect on that process. The closer you can get, the more associated problems can come with that closeness as well.
And is that the next step, Christopher? Because you mentioned this is volume 1 and you're going to write volume 2 and 3. Is that the next step, to immerse yourself in other people's experiences, or where are you going from here?
No. So in effect, when I had the contract for this book, I think in 2012 when I finished my PhD. And I looked back when I went to finish it last year. I looked back at the proposal, and it was all about the research, the findings, the data, etc. And this book has very little of that. Where there's discussions of the boxing, it's for to demonstrate problem strengths of doing research. So it's a methods book, basically. I'd go further. It's actually an ontology and epistemology book. I just don't want to call it that because it would put people off. So I talk about it as doing immersive research, which is exactly what it's about. But it's the doing of and the setting up of the research is volume 1. What good social science looks like. The second volume is the data, is this is what I actually did. So Number 1 is go do this. Number 2 is I did this. And then number 3 is going to be the complexity of all of that process. And basically come back and say, I said this in the first one and I did this in the second. Here's the problems with that and the tension between the two. So the first book is very much about getting going and research, get thinking deeply, yes, thinking philosophically about research and doing very good social science, but also doing it and starting the process. Number 2 is my process of it. And there's a lot of theoretical complexities that come on top of the relatively simple argument that I made in the first volume. So I do a lot of work on trying to understand what the emotions are. And I use a lot of Nick Crossley's work on intersubjectivity to try and figure out some quite fundamental theoretical ideas, which I really don't touch on in the first book. So the second book, I think, is far less of a wide appeal, very much more people who are interested in social theory and I guess sport will be into it. Whereas the first book is a general text, which I think was quite important for me to do, because if I had put all the detail that I want to put in the second volume into the first, it would have put so many people off. Yeah. The first book is not a sociology book. It's a research methods book that sociologists, psychologists, anthropologists, political scientists can all use. The second book will be more definitively about social theory and a bit of data, well, a lot of data, but that kind of more empirical, theoretical discussions in the second one.
And I know this is a dangerous question. Any time frames in terms of when those volumes 2 and 3 will be out? I know you should never ask academics about.
No, of course you can ask. I fundamentally disregard almost all deadlines. I'm very lucky to be able to work that way. But I'm almost certain I will do a book a year now for the next 3 years. That's my kind of, I've organized my work so that I can do that. So this will be almost certainly next year. I'd love it to be a year after the first one, but the great thing about this is that I'm able to stop and do loads of reading. I've done so much reading this summer. It's been fantastic. And I've learned so much, and it's really useful. It's really made me kind of very confident that the next book is going to be really useful, but it's also knocked it back. And my idea of March, I mean, when I think of that, I'm like, there's just no way. But then I look back and I know that this time last year, I had hardly any work done on the first volume, and it just all came together over winter, largely because of lockdown. I don't have kids, so my lockdown was actually brilliant. I don't like to tell people that too much, but I just got on with writing this book, basically. So anyway, yes, aiming for March, probably will not get it for the next one, and then the next one will be a year after that. So, and then another one that follows as well will be the year after that, hopefully. That's my plan.
Brilliant. Thank you. And do you want to do a little bit of plugging, Chris? Let people know where they can get the book, and also if they want to find out more about your work.
Yeah, that'd be excellent. So the main place to go is immersiveresearch.co.uk. So on there's a book page where people can find out about the book. There's a thoughts and ideas section, which has got loads and loads, I guess you'd call them podcasts, interviews with people, and a bunch of resources about doing research, academic writing, academic reading, and a bunch of other things. And connected to that, maybe by the time this is out, it's on the verge. I've got a membership site launching where I've got another bunch of content that I've been recording over the summer. That'll be free to access. And there's loads and loads of stuff about doing research on there, and access to my doing social science virtual labs, which are a monthly kind of session that I do where a bunch of people who are interested in this sort of work get together with me, and we talk through academic ideas. I might present some stuff about how to do interviews. That was the last one, and then we have some question answers. So if anyone wants to kind of be involved in that sort of stuff, then join up for that. There's a mailing list, there's the membership site soon, and all the information about the book there is on there. It's all the book is self-published, so it's all through that site, and that's explained there as well. And that's probably quite interesting for some people as well if they're interested in understanding that self-publishing process. I've found it to be fantastic, and there's videos up on the website about that as well.
Great. And your Twitter handle at Dr. C.R. Matthews, if people want to follow you there. Is that, yes. If you're happy for me to give that out.
Yeah, please do. Yeah, that's basically where I seem to have the best ability to reach people, which is somewhat problematic. I don't know how you feel about that, but I feel tied into Twitter, and I don't like that. That's one of the reasons why I've got my own website where I host all my research and sell my own book. Is it's mine and I control it. I hate these what I call parasitic websites where a lot of academics host their work, but it's another person's website. I struggle with that, and Twitter feels a bit like that to me.
Yeah.
Have you got access to other social media stuff for your podcast, or is it mainly Twitter?
It mainly goes through Twitter, but obviously we've got independent. I've got a few different hosting sites, and it goes through Apple Podcasts, and it goes through Spotify and so on as well. It works quite well, but I probably have a love-hate relationship with Twitter. Actually,
Yeah,
I moan about it, and then I spend a lot of time on it. So
me too. We have to find balance, don't we, with Twitter? I've come to realise how important it is.
Yes,
but that we have to manage it, and we have to not. I don't want to complain about it. I just want to do something about it. So if there's stuff that I don't like, I mute it. If I'm on it too much, I don't go on it, and then it all sorts itself out. That's my way of dealing with it, anyway.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Christopher. I really, really appreciate it. And thank you for being very patient in terms of being able to find a slot where we could actually do this. So I really do appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.